Hello, my name's Andy Challinor from the University of Leeds. I'm a professor of climate impacts and an author on the international dimensions of climate change, a chapter in both CCRA2 from a few years ago and also in the ongoing CCRA3. So you can think of this talk more of a kind of sketch, more of a Monet than a Minet in the top left. So giving you a broad overview rather than having time to go into details, which I hope we will pick up on in the discussions. So I'm going to start pretty much where I started quite some time ago, looking at heat stress, the impact of heat stress on crops. This is a rice crop affected by heat stress. Can be very short periods of high temperature that have a big effect on the crop. But ultimately, in a slightly hand-wavy way, we can say this is a climate impact with no large detectable impact on food production. There's the idea that we know this will be important, and we've kind of demonstrated that and can do some modelling on that. But it's not something we're detecting at the scale of the system as a whole. Skip forward a few years, and this was a paper from about 5 years ago. Current warming will reduce maize yields unless breeding and seed systems adapt immediately. So the idea here, again, without too much detail, is contrasting for RCP 2.6 and 8.5, the time of emergence of a temperature signal on crops. It's mean temperature in this case, a bit different to the previous graph. And what it shows is, obviously, in RCP 8.5, we get that occurring, and it occurs much sooner than in RCP 2.6. But the key point here is that it's comparing those numbers, that time of emergence in years, which is over the next couple of decades, to the average time it takes to breed, approve, and get a new variety into farmers' fields. And the point here is that climate change is in a sense outpacing the ability of maize breeding and delivery of new varieties, that whole pipeline, outpacing that pipeline of production of new crop varieties. For the case of maize. So seed systems need to adapt very quickly. It's not so much that climate is walloping us immediately, but it's how it compares to the background state of, in this case, breeding systems. But one could say more broadly, impacts emerge from biophysical socioeconomic systems. They don't just emerge from climate having an impact on a system. So that, if you like, is the first key point. So crop breeding not keeping pace with climate change, and we could do more in order to do that, is what that paper suggested. Skip forward a little bit more, and here we have a climate impact which does have more of a large-scale impact and a transmission pathway to the UK in this case. So this is a case study of silage shortage in 2017. The drivers were flooding in southeast Spain, cold temperatures in Italy, causing impacts, so shortage and resultant food price spikes through the economics of the system, and shortages in lettuce, courgettes, aubergines, capsicums, I think, as well. The responses were that some supermarkets opted for empty shelves, some were rationing, and I can remember around about that time the rationing in Morrison's, and I remember it particularly because it was the time that the government response to CCRA2 came out and was saying, I can almost recall the phrase, that the government took a more optimistic view of the functioning of markets in essentially being resilient to this kind of event. So this happened to occur around about that time. So what this tells us is that risks emerge when global biophysical socioeconomic systems are stressed in new ways. So it's new kind of stresses. So we can ask, well, are we keeping up with this kind of stress? In this case, there was some adaptation through diverse supply chain management. Since then, obviously, supermarkets have looked at their supply chains a little bit and tried to be more resilient to that, and it's been an ongoing area of research. So a key point here is adaptation is an adaptation to risk and not necessarily to impact. So we change the background state upon which the climate risk acts, and that's an important element of it. How are we doing with respect to that background state? COVID, EU exit, populism, how do they say, gestures broadly at everything. and perhaps specifically at Tim Benton's talk tomorrow, which I know, has more on this. Okay, so suddenly this sounds like a very complex system compared to what I started with. Climate affects a crop. Does that create problems? Yes, it does, but actually we should remember that climate is a global system, part of a system of systems, the Earth system, if you like, but it can apply global and coherent patterns of stress. This is the polar vortex, which can destabilize. This is from teaching slides, which has an effect on the jet stream. I think this is relatively common knowledge these days. And the interesting thing now is research that shows how these large-scale coherent systems, Rossby waves in this case, enhance the risk of concurrent heat waves in major breadbasket regions. So there's this idea, or there's this suggestion or proof that this global system can apply coherent stresses. So that's kind of good news in a way, because climate science is quite good at, we can quantify things with climate science. There's some quantitative science here that we can get a grip on. I want to say more about methods later on, so leave behind the topic of methods for now. The next key point is that sociopolitical responses can amplify the risk that comes out of this complex system. So we have a complex system that's climate acting through various background situations, if you like, from the perspective of climate, the background state. But actually the responses to that can amplify risk. So this is from a paper based off the CCRA2 chapter, more or less, transmission of climate risks across sectors and borders, where we looked at these kind of events. You can have a climatic trigger such as extreme weather. And an example here would be Russian wheat harvest failure across a very large region in 2010, which was the result of a climate trigger. And it was the response of markets to that shock in terms of export bans, et cetera, that then produced a feedback into the system through markets, market rules, policies, and these feedbacks occur over a range of timescales. So, so years to decades. Again, I've kind of hand waved a bit. There's more details in the paper, but the key point is that our own responses, the socio-political responses, can amplify the risk. So what we've seen so far is that we need to keep pace not just with climate change, but also with the evolution of risk cascades across sectors and borders. And I focused mostly up till now on food. But actually, there's a whole range of stresses. This is from the CCRA3 chapter forthcoming. A whole range of transmission pathways in energy, finance and markets, governance, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to give you the shopping list from CCRA2, for CCRA3. I don't want to give away the results of that analysis yet. I'll give you one example. Climate is an amplifier of existing drivers of risk through the risk of violent conflict, which is amplified via extremes and could potentially cascade to different countries around the globe through a different series of mechanisms, and can also, of course, be amplified via climate-induced food shortages. So there's kind of multiple pathways. And I think to just touch back on the importance of methods, to do this, keeping pace with this evolution of risk, we do need new methods. Not everything can be quantified, and no one view or model is fit for purpose across the full range of risks. Okay, so how seriously is this topic of international risk cascades and cascades across sectors and borders being taken? In some ways, one may say it's a very difficult thing to pin down. And it may be difficult to kind of generate or see enough evidence. This is from the report commissioned by the US Army, Implications of Climate Change for the US Army. You can see the text I've highlighted in bold. In light of these findings, greater intergovernmental and inter-organizational cooperation is needed. Need to proactively prepare for likely conflict and mitigate the impact of mass migration. So this is the US Army talking. This isn't a group that's kind of famed for trying to stir up activism, or this is being looked at coolly, and answers are coming out saying that it needs to be looked at very carefully. I think this in itself is an important indicator, an important piece of evidence. And it's been written on by various people, this idea of kind of all hell breaking loose in the Pentagon's perspective on climate change. Okay, so moving towards some conclusions. It's been a bit of a sketch, as I warned. The evidence for transmission of climate risks across sectors and borders has increased since CCRA2. So we have greater evidence from observed events, so the salad supply chain event of 2017, and more complex risk analysis that show risks of breadbasket failure due to simultaneous climate risks. The Rossby wave example I showed briefly is an example of that. There are also changes in geopolitics that favour risk amplification. EU exit will alter trade patterns and may produce just-in-time supply chains that may cause us problems. There's greater evidence of climate change acting as an amplifier of risk. So in the case of violent conflicts, both directly and also indirectly via food, via having an impact on food production. And there's evidence through major institutions taking the issue seriously. Some more conclusions, second slide of conclusions. We need to keep pace not just with climate change, but with the evolution of risks across sectors and borders. For that, we need resilience. So compare that again to the changes in background state that we're seeing at the moment. Resilience, I think, is an important concept. Again, Tim Benton will say more on this tomorrow, but the ability of a system to function under a shock, its system needs to be robust. How much of an impact does it have? Can it rebound? Will the system return to a pre-shock state? How flexible and adaptable is the system? And this is critical, I think, sort of going forwards, as they say. So, yeah, so there's that. And then, thirdly, I said I'd come back to the issue of methods. I think a clear language and frameworks and methods are needed to tackle these complex risk cascades. So we have existing integrated assessment models and a range of other methods, some of which are very, very good at being quantitative, some of which are very good at being qualitative. We're not so good at frameworks that put those two together. So we need to accept that some risks aren't quantifiable, but how do we retain an objectivity, or perhaps some people might argue with more greater philosophical underpinnings, we might say at least a common intersubjectively agreed consensus, if one doesn't believe in objectivity. How can we retain the let's call it objectivity of natural science, but also bring in all of the expertise in the other areas that of social science and other areas that are so important. And I wanted to just give one indicator in that direction. From the GCRF AFRICAP project, where we're developing what I'm calling an integrated assessment framework, I suppose, in contrast to an integrated assessment model. So we're combining models on the left here with workshops of scenarios of the future, what they might look like, with a whole host of other research in the bottom left. And these are coming into an integrated assessment framework. We also have internal workshops where we're keeping tight focus on rigorous science across those disciplines. And we've got a task force within country. So this is people kind of, if you like, beyond the kind of scientific domain, experts on in-country situation, politics, agricultural systems on the ground, for example. They're interacting with stakeholders, and the whole system is producing an online platform for results, for communicating with stakeholders that, of course, has been developed right from the very start. So I think this is a good way of thinking for methods to approach these risk cascades. And I'd be very interested in following up in discussions with anyone who is interested on that. I just wanted to finish with a very direct risk transmission mechanism. So we're stepping back from the complexity I've been talking about so far. This is from last year on, let's call it the OK Glacier, rather than its full name. The first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. And the monument acknowledges that we know what's happening, we know what needs to be done, and a poignant ending saying, you know, only you will know if we did. And I think this is important in grounding ourselves in the if I can call it, the immediacy of these risks, because it really is an immediacy. It's not obviously immediate in the way that recent COVID events, for example, are, but there's an immediacy there. And people talk about climate grief, you know, the way in which the climate crisis affects us, but it can be a positive thing, I think, where it serves to remind us of an underlying simplicity, and it orients us towards working towards solutions. So that's not too much of a philosophical ending to the talk, and I hope you've found it enjoyable, and I look forward to the discussion that we will have on the day or today. Thank you very much.